A lonely cowboy thought he could survive anything until the black horse beside him collapsed in the snow. Deep in the frozen frontier, Ghost is taken to a forgotten stable where broken war horses come to heal or die quietly. As winter tightens around the ranch, a silent boy begins trusting the wounded horse more than any person alive. But when fire tears through the stable at midnight, Ghost tries to stand and save others, even while his own body is failing. For the first time in years, the rider realizes he is not afraid of death. He is afraid of losing Ghost. Tonight's story is about loyalty, grief, and the quiet miracles God sometimes sends through wounded souls and faithful animals. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more journeys with the rider and Ghost. The winter after Lost Saints refused to end. Snow kept swallowing the plains day after day until the world looked less like land and more like an empty sky turned upside down. The rider and Ghost moved slowly across that endless white silence, beneath a ceiling of gray clouds that never seemed to break. The wind carried sharp needles of ice through the dead grass, and every wooden fence post they passed looked half buried like old gravestones forgotten by time. For the first few days after leaving Lost Saints, the rider convinced himself Ghost was only tired. The black horse had survived worse before. Ghost had crossed frozen rail bridges, storms, gunfire, hunger, and nights cold enough to crack water buckets into ice. A slight limp did not frighten him. At least that was what he kept repeating inside his own head. But the limp grew worse. Ghost no longer walked with the same steady rhythm the rider had trusted for years. The tall, black American quarter horse, once powerful enough to cut through storms like moving shadow, now dragged one rear leg slightly whenever the snow deepened. The faded white mark on Ghost's forehead disappeared beneath frost each morning. Sometimes the horse stumbled after only a few miles. Sometimes Ghost stopped listening to distant sounds entirely, which scared the rider more than the limp itself. Ghost had always noticed danger first. Always. The rider began waking during the night to the sound of Ghost breathing unevenly beside campfires barely strong enough to survive the wind. He noticed the horse eating less, not refusing food entirely, just enough to make fear grow quietly in the back of his mind. Still, he kept riding, because stopping meant admitting something he could not bear. Ghost might not recover this time. The rider rarely allowed himself to think about death anymore. Too many towns, too many graves, too many people buried beneath snow, dust, or railroad dirt. But Ghost was different. Ghost was not another drifting memory hanging from the saddle, beside old keepsakes and broken promises. Ghost was the only living thing that had remained beside him through every road that tried to kill them both. Late one evening, the storm became worse. The wind rolled across the plains with a hollow sound, like distant wolves crying beneath the earth. Snow reduced the world to shapes and shadows. The rider pulled his long, dark leather coat tighter around himself, while Ghost continued forward through drifts nearly reaching the horse's knees. The rider's weathered face looked older in winter light. His sharp cheekbones cut dark lines beneath tired, gray-brown eyes, hidden under the brim of his dusty black hat. Several strands of dark hair, streaked with gray, clung wetly against his temples. The gunshot wound in his shoulder from Lost Saints still hurt whenever the cold deepened, but he ignored it. Pain had become background noise long ago. Then Ghost stopped, not slowly, completely. The black horse froze mid-step. The rider frowned and touched the reins gently. Easy. Ghost tried to move. The rear leg collapsed instantly beneath the horse's weight. Ghost fell hard into the snow. The sound terrified the rider more than gunfire ever had. The rider jumped down so quickly he nearly slipped himself. Snow soaked through his gloves as he grabbed Ghost's neck, trying to steady the horse. Ghost struggled immediately, breathing hard through flared nostrils while attempting to rise again. The rider saw the pain in the horse's eyes before he saw the wound. Ghost's rear hoof had swollen badly beneath cracked leather wrappings. Dark infection spread upward through the leg like rot beneath bark. For several seconds the rider could not breathe. "No," he whispered. Ghost tried again to stand. The horse failed again. The rider grabbed the saddle and pulled with all his strength, even though it changed nothing. Ghost was too heavy, too weak, too exhausted. Snow clung to the black mane while steam rose from the horse's body into the freezing wind. "Come on," the rider said again, louder this time. "Come on, Ghost." His voice cracked. That frightened him too. Ghost lifted his head weakly every time he heard the name. The horse still trusted him enough to try. That trust nearly destroyed the rider inside. For the first time in many years, panic began replacing instinct. The rider looked around wildly through the storm, but there was nothing except endless white plains and dead winter, grass bending beneath the wind. He could not leave Ghost. He could not carry Ghost. He could not watch Ghost freeze to death in the dark. Then, far away through the blizzard, he noticed a faint yellow light. A lantern, small, unsteady, but real. The rider pulled his revolver and fired 3 shots into the sky. The sound vanished quickly into the storm. For several long minutes, nothing answered. Then Ghost reacted first. Even lying in the snow, the black horse raised his head slightly toward the darkness. The rider heard it a moment later. Bells, not church bells, small harness bells moving slowly through the wind. A wagon emerged through the snow like something from another lifetime. 2 lanterns swung gently beside an old wooden sled, reinforced with iron runners. Pulling it was an elderly chestnut mare with tired but calm eyes and a thick winter coat dusted white with frost. The old horse moved carefully, deliberately, without panic. Years of hard winters had shaped every movement into patience. Walking beside the sled was a tall, lean woman around 58 with short silver hair tucked beneath a worn wool hood. Her face looked weathered by wind, grief, and years spent outdoors, but her sharp gray-blue eyes remained steady and intelligent. Her hands were scarred badly across the knuckles and wrists, the hands of someone who had spent decades lifting wounded animals instead of speaking gently to them. Abigail Wren stopped several feet away and studied Ghost with the quiet expression of a person who already knew pain before reaching it. Behind her stood a boy no older than 11. Samuel Wren was thin and pale, beneath oversized winter clothes patched at the elbows. Freckles covered his nose and cheeks. Long blonde hair curled untidily beneath a fur-lined cap. The boy said nothing. He only stared at Ghost with enormous frightened eyes while gripping the lantern tightly against his chest. Then came the rehook moment. Ghost, barely conscious, suddenly stretched his neck weakly toward the silent boy. Sam froze. The lantern light trembled in his hands. Slowly, almost fearfully, the boy stepped closer through the snow until Ghost's muzzle touched the front of his coat. Ghost let out a low, exhausted breath against the child's chest. Sam's eyes widened. For the first time since arriving, Ghost looked calm. The rider noticed something strange then. Ghost had ignored food, pain, and commands for hours, yet the horse became still the moment the boy approached, as though Ghost recognized loneliness in another wounded creature. Sam carefully lifted one trembling hand and touched Ghost's neck. The boy did not speak, but tears suddenly filled his eyes anyway. Abigail looked at the scene quietly before kneeling beside Ghost's injured leg. She peeled back part of the frozen wrapping and examined the swollen infection beneath the hoof. Her expression darkened immediately. "This horse kept moving when it should have stopped weeks ago," she said. The rider's jaw tightened. I didn't have a choice." Abigail finally looked directly at him. "There's always a choice." The rider said nothing, because deep down he feared she was right. Ghost tried once more to stand as if ashamed of lying helpless in the snow. The movement nearly sent the horse collapsing sideways again. The rider instantly grabbed Ghost's head, holding him steady while whispering softly under his breath. The panic in his voice had not disappeared. Abigail rose slowly. "Con ngua nai kong can them jong ji," she said quietly in Vietnamese before switching back to English. "This horse needs to live." Together, Abigail and the rider carefully secured Ghost onto the sled beside old wool blankets, while Mercy stood unmoving against the wind like a patient guardian of dying things. Sam remained beside Ghost the entire time, one small hand resting gently against the black horse's shoulder. That night, the rider sat beside Ghost on the moving sled, while snow continued falling endlessly across the plains. He never removed his hand from Ghost's neck once during the long journey toward Mercy Stable, and every few minutes, just to make sure Ghost was still alive, he whispered the horse's name again. Mercy Stable stood alone at the edge of the frozen plains like a place forgotten by the rest of the world. The ranch had once served as a recovery stable for war horses after the Civil War, long before railroads and factories swallowed the frontier. Old cavalry brands still marked some of the wooden stall doors. Rusted horseshoes hung beside lantern hooks, blackened by decades of smoke. The wind moved slowly through the stable walls, carrying the scent of hay, leather oil, old pine wood, and the quiet exhaustion of animals that had survived too much. Nothing inside Mercy Stable felt rich or beautiful, but it felt alive. The rider noticed that immediately. Ghost was carried into the largest stall near the center of the barn because Abigail said injured horses panic less when they can hear other animals breathing nearby. The black horse barely reacted while they removed the saddle. That frightened the rider more than anything else so far. Ghost had always hated strangers touching him. Even after years together, Ghost still flattened his ears whenever unfamiliar hands reached too quickly toward the saddle straps. But now the horse only stood trembling beneath the lantern light, exhausted enough to stop fighting. Abigail Wren worked without wasting movement. She rolled up the sleeves of her heavy wool shirt, revealing scarred forearms lined with old burns and rope marks from another lifetime. Her face looked thin and weathered beneath the stable lights, but her sharp gray-blue eyes remained steady in the way only people who had seen too much death could manage. She did not speak gently while working. She spoke clearly, like a battlefield medic who understood panic killed faster than blood loss. "Hold him steady," she told the rider. The rider stood beside Ghost's head immediately, one gloved hand gripping the horse's neck while the other rested against the black mane damp with sweat and melted snow. Up close he could feel Ghost shivering. Abigail slowly removed the cracked rear horseshoe. The moment she exposed the hoof beneath it, the smell of infection spread through the stall. The rider's stomach tightened instantly. The hoof looked swollen and split near the edge, where old damage from lost saints had worsened beneath weeks of cold travel. Dark infection crawled upward beneath the tissue. Ghost jerked violently the moment Abigail touched the wound. The stall door slammed from the force of the movement. "Easy," the rider whispered quickly, pressing his forehead briefly against Ghost's neck. "Easy, boy." Ghost's breathing became rough and uneven. Abigail began cleaning the wound anyway. Ghost nearly kicked through the side of the stall. The rider had to grab the horse's head with both hands to keep Ghost from collapsing sideways. The black horse's muscles shook so hard beneath the lantern light that the rider could feel the tremors through his own chest. Sweat darkened Ghost's coat despite the freezing weather outside. Sam watched silently from the doorway. The boy had not spoken since helping bring Ghost into the stable the night before. He leaned against the wooden frame with cautious stillness, blonde hair hanging messily beneath his old winter cap, while freckles stood sharply against pale skin. His oversized coat nearly swallowed his thin frame entirely, but his eyes never left Ghost, not once. Mercy, the old chestnut mare, stood calmly in the neighboring stall chewing hay, with slow, patient movements. The elderly horse occasionally lifted her head toward Ghost whenever the black horse struggled, almost as if listening for something only horses understood. Abigail finally finished cleaning the wound and wrapped the leg tightly. Then she looked directly at the rider. "If he keeps traveling this winter," she said quietly, "he won't survive until spring." The words hit harder than bullets. The rider looked away first. Outside, snow scraped against the stable roof, while distant wind rolled across the plains. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The rider hated stillness. He hated staying anywhere long enough for silence to grow familiar. But worse than that, he hated hearing truth, spoken plainly. "He's survived worse," he muttered. Abigail shook her head once. "Not like this." The rider said nothing after that, because deep down he already knew she was right. The next several days passed slowly beneath endless snowfall. Mercy's stable moved according to the rhythm of animals. Instead of clocks, lanterns were lit before dawn, horses were fed before people ate, water buckets froze overnight and had to be broken open with iron tools each morning. Abigail worked constantly without complaint while Sam quietly followed behind carrying supplies too large for his small arms. The rider barely slept. Every time Ghost shifted inside the stall, he woke immediately. Every time the wind changed direction, he opened his eyes. Twice during the night he walked barefoot across the freezing stable floor just to place a hand near Ghost's nostrils and make sure the horse was still breathing. The rider himself looked worse each day. Dark circles formed beneath his tired, gray-brown eyes. His beard grew rougher. The old wound in his shoulder stiffened from cold and exhaustion, yet he refused to leave the stall longer than necessary. One evening Abigail found him sitting on an overturned crate beside Ghost, long after midnight. "You can't watch something live by refusing to sleep," she said. The rider stared ahead at the lantern flame instead of answering. Ghost lay quietly in the straw behind him, breathing shallowly. Abigail studied the rider for a moment before speaking again. "War horses used to do this," she said softly. "They'd keep marching until the body finally gave up underneath them." The rider finally looked at her. "Ghost ain't a war horse." "No," Abigail replied. "He's worse." That answer stayed inside the rider's head long after she walked away. Several days later, Sam entered the stall carrying a small tin bucket filled with warm water and slices of dried apple. The boy moved carefully, almost nervously, but Ghost immediately lifted his head when Sam appeared. The black horse still refused most food from anyone else. Yet when Sam stood nearby, Ghost slowly accepted the apple pieces from the rider's hand. The rider noticed it. "So he likes you," he muttered quietly. Sam gave the smallest shrug. Still no words, but for the first time the rider noticed something different in the boy's expression. Not fear exactly, recognition, as if Ghost's pain made sense to him somehow. Then came the rehook moment. Late that night, after nearly 4 straight days without proper sleep, the rider finally drifted off sitting against the stall wall beside Ghost. Snow tapped softly against the windows while the lantern flame flickered low. When he woke, the stable had gone completely silent. Too silent. Ghost was not moving. The black horse lay perfectly still in the straw. No breath, no sound. The rider froze instantly. For one horrible second, the entire world inside him stopped. Then he lunged forward, grabbing Ghost's neck hard enough to shake the horse slightly. "Ghost!" Nothing. Panic exploded through him so violently he could barely breathe. "Ghost!" Then, the faintest breath escaped the horse's nostrils, weak, barely there, but alive. The rider closed his eyes immediately, forehead pressed against Ghost's neck, while one shaking hand covered his own mouth. Outside, the storm continued across the plains, uncaring and endless. For the first time in many years, the rider whispered something that sounded dangerously close to prayer, not for himself, for Ghost. By the third week at Mercy Stable, the storms had become quieter, but the silence inside the rider had grown worse. Snow still covered the plains beyond the ranch in endless sheets of pale white, though now the wind moved slower across the fences and dead winter grass. Mercy Stable itself had settled into its own rhythm. Lanterns glowing before sunrise, old horses shifting softly inside wooden stalls, leather tack creaking gently from hooks near the walls. The place smelled constantly of hay dust, horse sweat, pine smoke, and medicine. Some mornings the rider woke before dawn and forgot where he was for several seconds. Then he heard Ghost breathing nearby and remembered everything at once. Ghost was alive, but barely recovering. The black horse could finally stand for short periods now, though the movement looked painful every time. The injured rear leg still trembled whenever Ghost put too much weight on it. Abigail refused to let the horse leave the stable yard. "Healing ain't the same thing as surviving," she warned more than once. "People confuse those two all the time." The rider rarely answered her anymore. He had become harder to speak to during those weeks. Exhaustion changed him slowly. The cold, gray-brown eyes beneath his weathered black hat looked darker now, hollowed out by too many sleepless nights. His beard had grown rough and uneven. Sometimes Abigail heard him pacing the stable long after midnight, while every other soul slept. Sometimes he split wood outside with such violent force that blood opened across his palms beneath the gloves. One afternoon, Sam watched him drive an axe into frozen logs until the wooden handle cracked from the pressure. The rider simply stared at the broken handle afterward like he no longer understood his own hands. He also started drinking again, not heavily, just enough whiskey at night to quiet the fear growing inside him. Abigail noticed immediately but never mentioned it. Instead, she gave him harder work each morning, fixing fence rails buried beneath snow, carrying feed sacks, repairing stable doors warped by winter moisture. She understood something about grief. The rider did not yet understand himself. People who feared losing something often destroyed themselves trying not to feel afraid. Ghost remained the center of everything. The rider still refused to let strangers near the black horse during the first days of recovery. If another ranch hand approached too suddenly, the rider's entire body stiffened instantly. The stable workers learned quickly to keep distance. Only Abigail and Sam could touch Ghost freely. Sam especially. The quiet boy spent more time in Ghost's stall than inside the house now. Many nights the rider woke and found Sam asleep beside the horse beneath old wool blankets, while Ghost rested nearby with his head lowered protectively over the child. Sam almost never spoke, but his silence no longer felt empty. It felt wounded. One evening, Abigail finally explained why. The two adults stood outside the stable watching snow gather along the fence posts, while lantern light glowed softly through the cracks behind them. "His father raised horses here," Abigail said quietly. "Best handler I ever knew." The rider listened without interrupting. One winter, a young stallion panicked during a storm. Rope snapped. Horse got frightened. Abigail paused. Sam saw the whole thing. The rider already knew the ending before she finished. "The horse kicked his father in the chest," Abigail said softly. "Dead before he hit the ground." Snow continued falling between them. Boy stopped talking 2 days later. The rider looked through the stable doorway toward Sam, sitting beside Ghost. Still blames himself, Abigail added. Kids usually do. The rider said nothing after that, because guilt was something he understood too well. A few days later, Sam approached him quietly near the water troughs and tugged once at the sleeve of his coat. The boy still avoided eye contact most of the time, but there was determination in the gesture. You want something? The rider asked. Sam nodded once, then walked away toward the far side of the ranch. The rider followed. Behind the main stable stood a smaller, weather-beaten barn, partially hidden behind snowdrifts and broken fencing. Inside came violent crashing sounds, followed by angry snorting. The rider stepped through the doorway carefully and immediately saw the source. A young, dun-colored Mustang thrashed wildly against a training rope inside the pen. The horse could not have been older than 3 years. Its coat looked rough from poor care, muscles tense beneath winter fur, dark mane tangled heavily around frightened eyes wide with panic. Old scars crossed the animal's shoulder and neck, signs of rough handling before arriving at Mercy Stable. Every movement carried raw distrust. The Mustang slammed against the wooden rails hard enough to shake the entire pen. No one can calm him, Abigail said from behind. She had followed silently. Been here near a month. The rider watched the horse carefully. Fear, not aggression, the same thing hidden beneath most violence. Sam slowly stepped toward the pen, despite Abigail tensing immediately. The Mustang reacted at once, rearing violently and snapping part of the rope loose. "Sam!" Abigail shouted. The horse exploded into panic, wood cracked. Snow scattered through the barn doorway as the Mustang nearly broke free entirely. Then came the rehook moment. From the nearby stable, Ghost suddenly lifted his head. The black horse had been lying weakly in his stall moments earlier. Now Ghost stared directly toward the chaos. Ghost did not stand, did not move toward the barn. Instead, the injured horse released one deep, powerful breath through his nostrils. Low, steady, commanding. The sound rolled across the stable like distant thunder. The Mustang froze instantly, not out of fear, recognition. The young horse lowered its head slowly, breathing hard while Ghost continued, watching from the far stall through the open barn doorway. Something invisible passed between the two animals then. Not magic, not supernatural, just the ancient language horses understood better than humans ever could. Calm, safety. The Mustang stopped fighting completely. Sam stared at Ghost with tears suddenly filling his eyes. Then, without realizing it, the boy whispered, "Stay." The word barely reached above the wind, but everyone heard it. Abigail covered her mouth instantly. The rider turned slowly toward Sam, as though afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too fast. Sam himself looked shocked, like the voice had belonged to someone else. Ghost lowered his head back into the straw afterward, exhausted from even that small effort. But the stable felt different now, warmer somehow. That night the rider sat alone beside Ghost's stall long after the lanterns dimmed. He kept thinking about the way Ghost had calmed the Mustang without even standing up. The black horse looked older now beneath the lantern glow, not weaker exactly, just tired in a way the rider had never allowed himself to notice before. Outside, snow slid softly from the stable roof. Then came another sound, boots approaching through ice, heavy, measured. Abigail entered first, expression already hardened. Behind her stood a broad-shouldered man around 50 with thick gray sideburns, a weathered brown coat expensive enough to show money but worn enough to show years of hard travel, and pale, tired eyes carrying the kind of bitterness that never fully healed. Jonah Creed removed his gloves slowly before speaking. His face had strong, square features weathered by cold and disappointment rather than violence, the kind of man who once believed in things too deeply and paid for it. He looked around Mercy Stable quietly before meeting Abigail's eyes. You've got until the end of the week, Jonah said. Abigail remained still. You already gave your warning. I'm giving the last one. The rider rose slowly beside Ghost's stall. Jonah glanced briefly toward him, then toward the injured black horse. That stable's drowning in debt, Jonah continued. Winter's killing business, railroad company wants the land before spring. Sam appeared silently near the doorway again, listening. Abigail crossed her arms. This place isn't for sale. Jonah's tired expression darkened slightly. Everything's for sale when people get hungry enough. No one answered him. Ghost lifted his head weakly from the straw, and for some reason Jonah looked away from the horse almost immediately. Winter settled deeper around Mercy's stable after Jonah Creed's visit. The storms no longer screamed across the plains every night, but the cold itself seemed heavier now, pressing against the stable walls like something patient and endless. Snow gathered along the fences, high enough to swallow the lower rails entirely. The old ranch looked isolated from the rest of the world, hidden beneath pale skies and drifting white silence. Some mornings the rider stood outside the barn before sunrise and stared across the frozen plains, as though trying to remember why he had ever kept moving in the first place. Ghost was improving. That was the problem. Not enough to travel, just enough to make leaving hurt worse. The black horse could now stand for longer stretches without collapsing immediately, though every step still dragged slightly through the straw. The injured rear leg remained swollen beneath the wrappings. Abigail changed every day. Some mornings Ghost managed short walks around the stable yard beside Mercy, the elderly chestnut mare moving patiently beside him like an old nurse guiding a wounded soldier home from war. The rider watched those walks from a distance, always silent, always afraid. He had begun noticing things he never allowed himself to notice before. Ghost's muzzle carried more gray than last year. The black horse took longer to rise after resting. Cold weather stiffened the injured leg faster at night. Tiny changes, honest changes, the kind time left behind slowly enough to ignore until one day they became impossible to miss. One evening Abigail found him alone in the tack room, repairing Ghost's saddle straps beneath lantern light. The room smelled of worn leather, saddle oil, and old cedar wood darkened by decades of smoke. Snow tapped gently against the windows while the rider worked in complete silence, rough hands threading fresh stitching through cracked leather. "You keep fixing gear like you're leaving tomorrow," Abigail said quietly from the doorway. The rider never looked up. "Habit." Abigail studied him carefully. Her silver hair hung loose around her weathered face tonight, and exhaustion lined the sharp edges of her eyes. "Habit ain't the same thing as purpose." That answer irritated him instantly. "Everything around here turns into a lesson eventually," he muttered. Abigail crossed her arms. "Only around people too stubborn to hear the truth the first time." The rider almost answered sharply back, then stopped, because Ghost suddenly coughed weakly inside the nearby stall. The rider stood immediately and disappeared into the stable before Abigail could say another word. That night the temperature dropped harder than it had in days. Wind pushed thin snow through cracks in the stable walls, while horses shifted restlessly in their stalls. The rider slept lightly beside Ghost again, boots still on, revolver belt hanging nearby out of old instinct more than necessity. Near midnight he woke to voices outside the stall. Abigail and Sam stood several feet away near the lantern rack, believing him asleep. "If Ghost keeps traveling with him," Abigail said softly, "that horse won't survive another winter." Sam looked toward Ghost immediately. The boy still spoke rarely, but his eyes said enough. "He loves that horse," Sam whispered carefully, the words awkward from years of silence. "I know," Abigail answered. "That's why he may have to let him stay." The rider remained completely still behind the stall door, but something inside him collapsed quietly. He did not sleep again after that. Hours later, long before dawn, the rider made his decision. The stable remained silent except for the breathing of horses and the soft groaning of wood beneath winter wind. Lanterns burned low along the walls, while frost spread slowly across the windows. The rider moved carefully through the darkness, gathering his belongings. He folded his blanket, cleaned his revolver, rolled spare ammunition into his saddlebag. Then he stopped beside Ghost's saddle, hanging near the stall door. For several seconds he simply stared at it. The worn leather carried years of dust, blood, snow, and memory. Small scratches marked old journeys across forgotten towns. Hanging beside the saddle were the objects already tied to Ghost's story: the repaired wooden doll from Lost Saints, an old railroad token, scraps of worn cloth from places long buried behind them. The rider slowly removed the saddle from its hook. That was when Ghost lifted his head. The black horse had been resting quietly moments earlier. Now Ghost watched him through the darkness with tired but alert eyes. The rider forced himself not to stop moving. "You stay here," he whispered roughly without looking directly at the horse. "You'll live longer." Ghost shifted immediately. Pain flashed through the horse's body the moment he tried to rise. "Don't," the rider warned softly. Ghost tried anyway. Then came the rehook moment. The black horse forced himself onto trembling legs. The injured rear leg shook violently beneath his weight. Ghost nearly collapsed sideways against the stall wall, but still tried to move toward the rider. The horse took one dragging step across the straw, then another. The rider froze completely. "Ghost!" The horse's breathing became ragged with pain, but Ghost kept moving toward him anyway. One more step. The injured leg finally failed. Ghost crashed hard against the wooden floor. The sound broke something inside the rider instantly. For a moment he looked less like a hardened cowboy and more like a man watching the last living piece of his soul die in front of him. The rider dropped the saddle. He crossed the stall in seconds and fell to his knees beside Ghost, grabbing the horse's neck tightly while Ghost struggled weakly beneath him. "Stop," the rider said, voice breaking completely now. "Please, stop." Ghost still tried to lift himself again. The rider wrapped both arms around the black horse's neck and finally lost the fight against his own emotions. Years of loneliness, exhaustion, fear, and buried grief collapsed at once. His shoulders shook violently while he pressed his forehead against Ghost's mane. For the first time in the entire series, the rider cried openly, not quietly, not hidden, broken. Ghost finally stopped struggling. The horse simply rested his head weakly against the rider's shoulder. Outside, the storm continued moving across the plains. Neither noticed Sam standing silently near the stable doorway, watching everything. The boy's eyes filled slowly with tears, because for the first time since his father died, Sam saw a grown man who loved something enough to fall apart for it. Hours later, before sunrise, several miles from the stable, another kind of desperation unfolded. A group of young laborers huddled beside a supply shed near the eastern hay barn. Most looked barely older than boys themselves. Their coats were patched and thin, faces hollow from winter hunger. Cheap whiskey bottles passed between red, cracked hands, while frustration hardened into recklessness. At the center stood a narrow-faced ranch worker named Ellis Pike, 24 years old, sharp-eyed and bitter after losing railroad work before winter. A thin scar crossed his jaw beneath uneven stubble. Ellis blamed Mercy Stable for keeping valuable land untouched while poor men starved nearby. "Creed'll buy the place cheaper if part of it burns," Ellis muttered drunkenly. "Old woman won't survive another winter rebuilding." Another worker hesitated. "Did Creed tell us to do this?" Ellis shook his head. "Don't matter." The youngest among them looked nervous. There are horses in there. Ellis stared toward the stable lights glowing faintly through snow. Then maybe somebody finally learns the world don't feed broken things forever. The torch touched dry hay. At first the flames looked small, then the wind changed, and the eastern barn roof caught fire. The fire spread faster than anyone at Mercy Stable believed possible. Winter wind turned the eastern hay barn into a furnace within minutes. Flames climbed dry wooden beams with a roaring sound that swallowed the storm itself. Snow spun wildly through the orange light while smoke rolled upward into the black sky like something alive. Horses screamed inside the stable long before people fully woke. The sound tore through the ranch harder than gunfire. The rider was already moving before his mind caught up. 1 second he stood beside Ghost's stall. The next he was outside in the snow, pulling open stable doors, while sparks flew across the yard like burning insects. "Get water!" Abigail shouted somewhere through the smoke. The old ranch suddenly exploded into chaos. Horses slammed against stall doors in blind panic. Leather straps snapped. Lanterns swung violently from ceiling hooks, while frightened animals kicked hard enough to shake the entire stable. Mercy Stable had cared for damaged horses for decades, many already half traumatized before arriving there. Fire turned old fear into madness again. The rider fought to keep control of the nearest stalls, while smoke thickened around him. His long coat quickly became covered in ash and melting snow. The old wound in his shoulder screamed every time he forced another frightened horse backward, but none of that mattered, because behind him, Ghost was trying to stand. The black horse could hear the panic spreading through the stable. Every terrified scream from the other animals hit Ghost like instinct cutting through pain. The rider saw Ghost trembling violently inside the stall, trying to force weight onto the injured rear leg. "Don't," the rider warned immediately. Ghost ignored him. The horse stumbled forward against the wooden gate. The rider crossed the stall in seconds and grabbed Ghost's neck tightly. "Stop." Ghost tried again anyway. The rider had never realized until now how much of Ghost's identity came from protecting others. The horse did not understand survival the same way humans did. Ghost only understood movement toward fear. Outside, another explosion of sparks burst across the roof as part of the eastern barn collapsed inward. Then came Sam's scream. The rider turned instantly. Near the burning barn, several loose horses had broken free from their pens and were stampeding blindly through smoke and snow. Sam stood frozen near the center of the yard beside an overturned water bucket, while terrified animals thundered toward him. Mercy moved first. The old chestnut mare burst from the stable despite her age, forcing herself between the frightened horses and the child. Mercy's broad body slammed sideways against a panicked gelding, hard enough to redirect the animal away from Sam. Another horse nearly trampled the boy before Mercy shoved him backward with her shoulder. "Sam!" Abigail screamed. The rider ran through the smoke toward them. One frightened horse slipped on ice and crashed into the fencing beside Sam. Wood splintered violently. Snow, ash, and sparks filled the air. Mercy stayed planted between the boy and the chaos, even while shaking from exhaustion, even while coughing heavily from smoke. The rider finally reached Sam and dragged him backward, just as another burning section of roof collapsed nearby. "Get inside!" he shouted. Sam looked toward Mercy immediately. "Mercy! Now!" The boy obeyed reluctantly while Abigail and several ranch hands continued fighting the flames with buckets and snow-covered blankets. The storm itself became part of the fire now, wind feeding oxygen into the blaze faster than anyone could stop it. Then came the rehook moment. Inside the stable, Ghost suddenly let out a deep, violent cry, unlike anything the rider had heard from him before. Not fear, urgency. The rider spun around. Ghost had somehow forced himself completely upright. The black horse stood trembling inside the smoke-filled stall, barely able to balance, injured legs shaking hard beneath him. Yet Ghost was not looking at the fire. Ghost stared toward the far corner of the stable, toward a small stall hidden behind stacked feed sacks. The rider's stomach dropped instantly. A young mule colt stood trapped there behind fallen debris, too terrified to move while smoke thickened around the ceiling beams. The little animal could not have been older than 1 year old, gray-coated and skinny beneath rough winter fur. Terror had frozen it completely. Ghost struck the stall gate hard with his shoulder, once, twice, demanding. The rider understood immediately. "Damn it," he muttered. He wrapped cloth across his mouth and forced himself deeper into the smoke. Heat burned against his skin while sparks rained from overhead beams. The mule colt panicked the moment he approached, eyes wide and rolling white with terror. The rider grabbed the rope halter and cut part of the debris free with his knife. Just before another beam crashed nearby, he dragged the colt out seconds before the corner stall collapsed entirely. Outside, Ghost finally lost strength. The black horse nearly collapsed the moment he saw the young animal safely outside. The rider caught Ghost before the horse fully hit the ground. "You stubborn bastard," he whispered roughly. Ghost's breathing sounded ragged and painful now, but calm. Hours passed before the fire finally died. By dawn, only part of the eastern hay barn remained standing. Smoke drifted slowly across the frozen ranch, while exhausted horses huddled together beneath blankets and frost. Abigail moved silently among the animals, checking injuries, while ranch hands repaired broken fencing beneath gray morning light. Mercy stood alone near the stable entrance. The old mare looked different now, older. Her breathing had become shallow after hours inside smoke and freezing wind. Ash clung across her chestnut coat, while her legs trembled from exhaustion. Sam refused to leave her side all morning. The rider noticed the way Abigail watched Mercy, the same way she once watched Ghost. Days passed quietly after the fire. The storm finally weakened, but Mercy did not recover. The old mare stopped eating much by the third morning. She lay down more often. Sam slept beside her every night beneath wool blankets, while Abigail sat nearby in silence. Nobody said the word dying. They did not need to. Then one pale winter morning, Sam walked into the stable carrying fresh water and stopped. Mercy lay peacefully in the straw beneath weak lantern light. Still. The old mare looked almost comfortable, as though she had simply grown too tired to continue carrying the weight of another winter. Sam slowly knelt beside her. For a long time, he said nothing. The rider watched quietly from the doorway, while Ghost rested nearby in his stall, ears lowered toward the scene. Finally, Sam wrapped both arms around Mercy's neck and buried his face against the old horse's coat. "Thank you for staying," the boy whispered, a full sentence, clear, broken, real. Abigail turned away immediately, unable to hide her tears anymore. That night the stable felt emptier. The rider sat beside Ghost long after everyone else slept. Snow drifted softly beyond the windows, while lantern light painted tired gold shadows across the stall walls. For the first time in years, the rider talked openly, not because someone asked, because silence had finally become heavier than memory. He told Ghost about towns buried by dust storms, about railroad camps filled with graves, about people he failed to save, about all the places he left before attachment could turn into pain. "I always thought leaving first made it easier," he admitted quietly. Ghost rested his head weakly against the rider's shoulder. The rider closed his eyes briefly. Then, slowly, Ghost stood up on his own. The movement looked painful. The injured rear leg still dragged slightly beneath him, but the black horse remained standing, weak, shaking, alive. The snow finally stopped 3 days after Mercy died. For the first time in weeks, sunlight touched Mercy's stable without disappearing behind storm clouds. Pale winter light spread slowly across the ranch, turning the snowfields silver beneath the morning sky. Smoke no longer rose from the burned eastern barn. What remained of the structure stood blackened and broken against the horizon, like the skeleton of something old that had survived one final war. The stable itself had grown quieter after Mercy's death, not empty, just quieter in the way homes become after losing a soul that held everything together. The rider noticed Ghost searching for the old mare during the first mornings afterward. The black horse sometimes lifted his head toward the empty stall beside him before lowering it again slowly. Animals understood absence differently than humans. They did not ask questions about death. They simply carried the silence left behind. Sam spoke more now. Not constantly, but enough to make the stable feel less haunted. The boys still moved carefully through conversations, as if words remained fragile things that could disappear again if handled too roughly. Yet every morning he greeted Ghost softly before feeding the horses, and every evening he sat beside the black horse, telling quiet stories about Mercy in short, broken sentences. "She liked storms," Sam whispered one night while brushing Ghost's mane carefully. "She hated loud people, though." Ghost lowered his head slightly closer to the boy. The rider watched from nearby without interrupting. Something inside him had changed after the fire, or maybe something inside him had finally stopped running. A few days later, Jonah Creed returned. The sound of approaching wagons spread through the frozen ranch early that morning. Abigail stepped outside, expecting lawyers, deputies, or railroad men prepared to force Mercy's stable closed. Instead, she found something entirely different. People, dozens of them. Farmers from nearby valleys arrived first with lumber strapped to sleds. Old veterans came carrying tools and fence wire across tired shoulders. A mail carrier with a crooked nose unloaded crates of nails beside the damaged barn. Two grown sisters who once learned horseback riding at Mercy's stable brought blankets and sacks of grain. Even several rough railroad workers appeared quietly at the edge of the property holding fresh timber. None of them waited for permission. They simply started rebuilding. The rider stood beside Ghost outside the stable, watching the ranch slowly fill with movement and noise again. Hammers echoed across frozen ground, while smoke rose from cooking fires near the fence line. Horses shifted calmly beneath winter sunlight as broken walls slowly became whole. Jonah Creed arrived last. He rode alone beneath a dark wool coat dusted with snow, broad shoulders slightly bent from years harder than most people knew. Up close, his face looked older than before. The sharp lines around his pale eyes carried exhaustion more than cruelty now. The expensive leather gloves and weathered coat still marked him as a businessman, but grief lived too openly in the man to mistake him for simple greed. He dismounted near the stable gate, holding folded papers beneath one arm. Abigail approached first. "You come to throw us out while people are rebuilding?" Jonah looked around quietly, at the workers, at the repaired fences, at Sam carrying wood beside ranch hands nearly 3 times his size, at Ghost standing weakly beneath the winter sun. Then Jonah slowly lowered the papers in his hand. "My son stayed here once," he said unexpectedly. Nobody answered. Jonah stared toward the empty stall where Mercy once slept. "After the war." His voice roughened slightly. "Boy came home scared of everything. Couldn't sleep near people anymore." Abigail's expression softened carefully. "He spent 2 months here brushing horses that were half dead themselves," Jonah continued. "First place he smiled after the fighting." The rider remained silent beside Ghost. Jonah looked down at the folded papers. "When he died later," he stopped briefly. "I blamed this place for teaching him softness." The wind moved quietly across the ranch. but maybe softness wasn't the thing that killed him. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Jonah tore the foreclosure papers in half, just like that. No speeches, no dramatic redemption. Only an exhausted man, finally too tired to keep fighting ghosts of his own. Re-hook moment. As the torn papers scattered into the snow, Ghost suddenly stepped forward on his own. The movement immediately drew everyone's attention. The black horse walked very slowly across the stable yard toward Jonah Creed. Every step dragged slightly through the snow. The injured rear leg still trembled beneath Ghost's weight, but the horse continued anyway. Jonah froze. Ghost stopped directly in front of him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Ghost lowered his head quietly against Jonah's shoulder. Not fear, not submission, forgiveness. Jonah's entire face tightened instantly as though something inside him had cracked open after years sealed shut. He closed his eyes briefly and rested one gloved hand against Ghost's neck. "I don't deserve that," he whispered, but Ghost remained there anyway. That moment spread through Mercy Stable more powerfully than any speech could have. By evening, the ranch no longer looked abandoned, not fully healed either, but alive. That night, Abigail invited everyone into the main house for supper except the rider, who stayed behind beside Ghost's stall beneath lantern light. He preferred distance during gatherings. Always had. Abigail found him there later carrying something wrapped carefully inside old cloth. Without speaking, she handed it to him. The rider slowly unwrapped the bundle. Inside rested Ghost's cracked horseshoe. The iron looked worn thin from years of travel. Small fractures crossed the metal near the edges where the injury had worsened after lost saints. The rider stared at it silently. "There are creatures," Abigail said softly, "that stop surviving because of strength alone." The rider looked up. "They survive because someone still gives them a reason to come back." Ghost lifted his head slightly from the stall behind him. Abigail smiled faintly before walking away. Much later that night, beneath soft lantern light and drifting snow outside the windows, the rider tied the cracked horseshoe carefully beside the old keepsakes hanging from Ghost's saddle, the repaired wooden doll from lost saints, faded railroad tokens, scraps of cloth from forgotten towns, tiny pieces of lives carried across years of wandering, a timeline made from memory, not victory. Morning arrived clear and painfully bright. The rider saddled Ghost slower than ever before. No rushed movements, no hard pulls on the reins. Ghost stepped carefully from the stable into fresh, untouched snow. The rear legs still dragged slightly with every few steps. The black horse would never run like before again. The rider understood that now, and finally accepted it. Sam stood near the fence watching them leave. His freckled face looked stronger somehow, beneath the winter light. "You'll come back?" the boy asked quietly. The rider adjusted his gloves before answering. "Yeah," he said. "Someday." Ghost stopped briefly beside Sam, long enough for the boy to touch the horse's neck one final time. Then they left Mercy Stable together. Not fast. Not like old days. The rider walked part of the way beside Ghost instead of riding immediately. Ahead of them, far beyond the frozen hills, a line of stranded migrant wagons stood trapped near a snow-covered trail. The rider noticed them first. Ghost noticed them second. Neither changed direction away. The rider simply placed one hand gently against Ghost's neck and continued walking beside the black horse toward the distant figures lost in the snow. Because somewhere ahead, someone still needed help, and as long as Ghost could keep walking, the rider would never truly walk alone. Sometimes God does not send miracles the way people expect. Sometimes miracles arrive tired, wounded, and limping through the snow beside us. In a world that often moves too fast, the rider learned that love is not proven by never falling apart, Love is staying beside someone after the breaking begins. Ghost could no longer run like before, yet the horse still chose to walk forward beside the man who refused to abandon him. Maybe that is what faith really looks like in everyday life. Not perfection, not strength, just loyalty that survives pain, winter, and fear. Every one of us carries wounds the world cannot see. Some people hide loneliness behind silence. Some keep walking even when their hearts are exhausted. And sometimes God places a person, an animal, or a small act of kindness in our path simply to remind us we are not meant to survive life alone. If this story meant something to you, share where you are watching from in the comments. Tell us about a person or animal who stayed beside you during your hardest season. And if you want more cinematic journeys with the rider and ghost, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join this growing campfire of stories. May God watch over you, protect the people you love, and guide you safely through every storm still waiting on the road ahead.